Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of this first look series that we're doing into Fellowship. I'm Helix, and today we are going to be taking a look at Vigor, one of the other two healers that are currently in the game. Aside from Sylvie, Vigor is more akin to a classical priest. Instead of, casting a bunch of healing over time effects, he typically has these large, big ticket healing spells that he casts, as well as shields and sort of area of effect healing that he has at his disposal. But without further ado, let's just jump straight into his abilities. So jumping into Vigor's capabilities, he has, much like every other character in Fellowship, one of two things. He's either got an interrupt if he's a tank or a DPS, or if he's a healer class, so far that we've seen, he has a sort of cleansing ability. In this case, that ability is going to be called Remove Magic, which all it does is removes a harmful effect from an ally. Whether it's a damage over time or other magic effects, it basically just wipes the board clean. The next ability we have is called Circle of Light, which is one of his two AoE sort of healing effects. All it is a area that he sort of chooses on the ground. All allies within that area receive health. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's an instant cast that has a little bit of a cooldown to it, but more or less you can use it fairly frequently. The second ability he has is going to be called Radiant Blast. Radiant Blast is the words that I was looking for. Basically is a cone of light that he shoots in front of him that either heals allies that are caught within it or damages enemies that are caught within it. Moving on to his second set of abilities are his primary healing and protective kit. First, you start with Greater Heal, which, as the name might imply, is basically just a long cast healing spell. A 2-second cast and heals your ally for health. The second ability is going to be Rune of Renewal, which, when cast, instantly heals your target ally and also puts a buff onto them that increases healing received from your abilities. It has an ability that sort of echoes 25% of the heal's value onto the target and generates some extra Radiant Rune, which is secondary resource that we'll talk about in a moment or two. And then finally, his protective kit tool is called Luminous Barrier, which basically just puts a shield on him that sort of mitigates damage that is coming his way up to a certain amount or until the time runs out. Jumping into his last set of abilities, his last three, are kind of his damaging abilities that he has whenever he's not actively casting and healing people. The first is going to be Dawn Flare, which is just a cast damage. After 1.5 second cast, it deals damage to the opponent. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Moving then into Soul Brand, whereas the Rune of Renewal was sort of the healing sort of instant cast sort of effect. Soul Brand is the reverse damaging one, where what you do is you instant cast a damage over time effect onto an enemy that generates sort of increased Radiant Rune production, which again we'll talk about in just a moment. And then finally, in this last set of abilities, you have Dawnbreaker Orb, which is basically an instant cast orb that you launch forward from in front of you that either heals allies that it comes into contact with or damages enemies that it comes into contact with. But again, going back to the secondary resource for Vigor is what's known as Radiant Rune. Spells like Greater Heal and, Rune of Renewal generate basically any healing and any damage that Vigor does generates this Radiant Rune. And then from there, you can spend that on things like the Luminous Barrier, requires Radiant Rune. You have the Dawnbreaker's Orb. You have the Soul Brand that also requires Radiant Rune to cast. And when it comes to like the Rune of Renewal or the Soul Brand, fortunately, those two things go towards generating more Radiant Rune a little bit faster. But other than that, your primary sort of attack and heal, your Greater Heal and your Dawn Flare just cost mana. Circle of Light costs mana. Radiant Blast costs mana, and that's sort of the breakdown between Radiant Rune and your mana. And so with that quick overview of Vigor's initial kit, because as always, once again, this is a baseline Vigor, a level 1 if you would. So you basically just have his base 9 abilities. Nothing else is currently unlocked. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our dungeon run. All right, so jumping straight into it, we are going to be going once again to Aperian Sands. It seems like this is one of the favorite sort of adventures that comes out of the quick play option, which is what I've been doing, because for those of you that haven't been following the open beta, there is currently some matchmaking issues when it comes to the challenge mode. So quick play is, one, just a lot easier to sort of get into games, but two, it's also a good chance and test to sort of get a feel for some of the newer characters, which is exactly what I'm doing. So the big thing about Vigor from this initial play that I've learned is he, unlike, Sylvie that has a bunch of AoE and sort of management, Vigor is fairly simple in his healing. If you see your ally has low health, then you cast a healing spell on him or her. Really, it's just a matter of which of your healing spells you have. You have 2 sort of instant cast AoE heals. You have 1 sort of long form cast heal, and then you have 2. I guess technically you have 3 sort of instant cast AoE heals in the orb, the Dawnbreaker's orb that we were talking about. But so yeah, again, pretty straightforward character. Not too much, preparatory goes into, your healing capabilities. You just see damage and then you heal damage. What I will say is this is the one character that I've experienced that feels a little disjointed. You have these sort of long cast abilities and then you have your Radiant Rune abilities, but truthfully, the Radiant Rune abilities don't feel very impactful. You have the Rune of Renewal and you have the Soul Brand, which cost Radiant Rune, that you can sort of cast onto either allies and enemies that helps generate more Radiant Rune. But aside from those 2 abilities, the only other thing that costs Radiant Rune in his initial kit, obviously this may change as you unlock more things, is his barrier, which, is nice, but it isn't, massively impactful, I would say. It's nice to put a little a buff on, your tank or any character that sort of takes a quick dose of damage, but, then that's it. You basically just cast your Radiant Rune on Radiant Rune generators, and then you wait for the next opportunity to cast your barriers. And so, don't get me wrong, the barrier is good, the barrier is handy, but it almost feels like it's not worth it. I don't know if that's the right way to sort of say it, but, this seems like an ability that could have just cost mana instead of having to worry about whether or not you have the resource capable of casting the barrier. But, aside from that, if you don't, then you just heal the damage. If you know that certain large doses of damages are coming out, you can sort of prep a Rune of Renewal, which increases the amount of healing that goes onto a target. But then if all else fails, you have 3 sort of instant cast heals in the Circle of Light, the Orb, the Dawnbreaker's Orb, and then the Radiant Blast. And 2 of those abilities also deal damage. Sure, they may not heal quite as much as like the targeted greater heal, but instant cast is instant cast. If someone goes through a sudden and immediate bout of damage, then you can quickly sort of throw out some healing to sort of mitigate instead of having to, instead of necessarily trying to go preactive by putting the barrier out there. So again, don't get me wrong, character feels good. I know the character is effective. Some of the higher leaderboards right now run Vigors as, characters, as sort of the healer of the group. Vigor is definitively effective. His healing spells are quite potent. He can definitely keep people topped off, as opposed to Sylvie, where you can kind of weave in damage between some of the healing. A lot of times Vigor feels like you have to choose one or the other. You are either healing or you are either damaging. And more often than not, since all of his healing spells are just sort of bulk heals, it feels like a lot of the time you're healing, especially with a tank like Helena, who doesn't necessarily heal herself. I think she has later sort of in her kit, I think she has a self-healing ability, but whereas Mako has a lot of healing that she can weave into sort of her rotation, allowing Vigor to get some more damaging abilities and capabilities in. Whenever you're sort of paired with a Helena, you can do a very good job at keeping her alive, but it feels like more often than not, you're casting healing spells without the ability to really weave in damage, which, again, isn't necessarily a flaw of Vigor. It's kind of just the composition you're running. Vigor is very good at keeping Helena and the tanks alive. You can see just from the healing bars going on that if someone's at, a third of the health left, a simple heal from Vigor can more or less bring them to, 80, 90% health. He's very, very good at, keeping people alive, which is exactly what you want from a healer. Overall, he's not a bad character. Again, as I was saying a little earlier, he feels a little disjointed when it comes to his secondary resource, but I don't think his kit necessarily feels, disjointed. He has a nice proactive barrier that he can put on if he knows that large doses of damage is coming out, but he also has some good, versatility in his healing. He's got a proactive barrier. He's got just his baseline, magic cast. He's got a couple of AoEs that he can cast in, certain circumstances. If he only needs a little bit of healing along everyone and wants to get some damage out, Radiant Blast or the Dawnbreaker's Orb satisfies both of those needs. If he needs a more targeted healing, a more targeted healing to all of his party, the Circle of Light definitely gives a little bit more healing, because you're sort of removing the damage aspect of the ability. So, you've got a larger AoE healing. And then from there, he's got, a couple damaging abilities that feel unique enough. Obviously, more often than not, you're just sort of spamming Dawn Flare if you have time and a window to do some damage after casting Soulbrand. But then again, you still are dealing damage with the other two sort of instant cast abilities sort of in the mix. So again, he feels fun. He feels impactful. He is a little simpler on the difficulty scale, which, there's nothing wrong with that. Helena's also one of the more easier characters to pick up, but she's also effective and fun. But overall, if you're looking for a quick, easy to pick up, yet effective healer, I think Vigor might be for you. He's, again, very user-friendly. You can come in without having to worry too much about rotation, without having to worry too much about, when you should be using certain abilities and sort of preparing for large doses of damages. You just see damage and you heal damage. You've got some proactive. There's definitely some, not fine-tuning. There's definitely some, skill to him. If you want to sort of play at the higher levels, there's definitely some, rotation and knowing when to use certain abilities that you can definitely learn and master. But if you just want to jump in for a quick game without having to consider, too much implications of what your spells do or the next ability that's coming up, Vigor's very easy to just sort of jump in and just start healing people. And so overall, I had fun. He's a good healer. He's an enjoyable healer. Personally, for me, I prefer more of the complex characters, so I may not be going too much to him in the future. But again, he's a good, effective healer that I think anyone can really have fun with and jump in and immediately start playing. So with that, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.